You know, fear cripples so many believers. But what does Jesus walking on the water have to do with our fear? Why does Jesus address the fear of his disciples by walking on water? Once you see the deeper revelation in this miracle, you'll begin to see more victory over fear in your life. So let's jump into the text and see what the scripture has to say. In Matthew 14:22, it says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds." So as good Bible readers, we should try and figure out what is it that just took place. Well, if you read the story prior to this, Jesus has just fed 5,000 men, okay, right here. He just did the multiplication of bread and fish, and he fed 5,000 men besides women and children. And guess who got to be a part of that miracle where Jesus multiplied the food to feed the multitudes? Well, the disciples got to be a part of that. So as we approach this text, we have them closing that down. Those crowds are being dismissed, and the disciples are getting into the boat. That's the scene that we need to have in our minds. That's the context, okay? So the setting helps us understand exactly what's taking place. While he dismisses the crowds, they're getting into the boat, and after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And so what's the setting? Well, we have the disciples getting into a boat, which I'll highlight in yellow, anything referring to them, and we have Jesus on a mountain praying by himself. Okay, that's the scene that we have as Jesus approaches them. When evening came, he was there alone. And this is very important because Jesus often prays a lot by himself. But on the other hand, we see the disciples, right? So the scene changes, and we have them in the boat by this time, and it's a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. In other words, they're in the middle of a very scary and, life-threatening storm. This storm helps us understand what's taking place when Jesus ends up walking on water. So here's the scene, right? They're in a boat. They're far from land. They're beaten by the waves. It is evening time. And again, this helps us understand the deeper things that Jesus does just by capturing the setting of the story. For the wind is against them. So you can imagine how scared they are at this point, how frustrated they are. They've spent a lot of time rowing by this time because of the fact that the wind and the waves are against them. So they're having a lot of opposition. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them. So this ends up being pretty late. I want to say it's in 1 a.m., 2 a.m. I could be wrong, but let me know in the comments. Either way, this is very late in the night, and they're still beaten by the waves. Wind is against them, and in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them. And who's that? Well, Jesus. How does he come to them? Well, he ends up walking on the sea. So let's think about the setting and the state of the disciples as Jesus approaches them on the sea. Remember, they have opposition. They're probably terrified with this storm coming against them. They're far from land, probably fearing for their lives, probably frustrated and confused. And we can definitely know that there's fear creeping into their hearts because of the way that they respond to seeing Jesus. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, and this is super important because here we have Jesus walking on the water, which is a pattern all throughout the Old Testament, but we're not going to get to that today. They were terrified, and this is very important. How do they respond? What's their first thought when they see that? Well, they're terrified, and they go, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. Now, I'm not going to minimize the legitimate fear they're experiencing, but to think the only realistic option, the first option is it's probably a ghost. We're terrified. We're in fear. That tells us the condition Jesus finds them in when he's walking on the water. And this is going to address the fear we experience in our life, but the example in this narrative is the fear of the disciples, okay? But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." So what does Jesus do to address fear in this situation? You know what he does? He walks towards them. But that ends up causing them even more fear and terror because they're not initially aware of who it is that they're seeing. They think it's a ghost. And I think oftentimes in our own lives, when we see God interact with us and invade our world, oftentimes there can be an initial kind of fear. And a lot of people forget about that there's a healthy reverential fear of God, not a terror like the disciples are experiencing, but sometimes when the supernatural, spiritual, all-powerful, eternal God intersects our world and invades our reality, it can come off as something that looks initially scary. But the fear of the Lord is appropriate, not this kind of terror that it's a ghost, okay? But immediately Jesus spoke to them, and he says what? Not only does he come to them, this is very important, but he speaks to them. And he says, take heart, it is I, don't be afraid. Jesus could have somehow come to the disciples on the other side of the land a different way. He could have let them fight through these waves. He could have let them deal with the wind that was against them. He could have let them endure and get to the other side while he remained alone. But why does Jesus end up choosing to meet them very late in the evening? This is a question we ask. Why does he wait so long when they've endured so much to actually come and meet them? Why does he let them sit in that initial fear that is creeping up and growing in them as they're looking at how far they are from the land? Why does Jesus allow that, right? That's a question we should ask, but we know the answer to another question, which is, how does Jesus respond to their fear? Well, how does he approach them? He comes to them walking on the sea. In other words, whatever Jesus is doing here, by choosing to come to them in this way, it's going to address the fear that is present. There's something about Jesus walking on water that is addressing their fear, okay? Not just of the fact that it's a ghost they see, but there seems to be, and we see this in the story of Jesus calming the storm, they're afraid they're going to die. This doesn't seem to be much different. They seem to have that same fear. Jesus spoke to them. What does he say? He says, I'm going to highlight this in yellow, take heart, be encouraged, be of good courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. So what is it that Jesus chooses to say that is supposed to eliminate fear? They're supposed to recognize, oh, that's Jesus, so we can be encouraged and not be afraid, right? Look at how Peter responds, though. And a question I always have is, why does Jesus invite Peter to walk on the water? Well, Peter answered this word from Jesus, take heart, it is I. And in the mind of Peter, this seems to be like the logical conclusion. Hey, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now that's interesting. Peter says, command me to come to you. Why does Peter need Jesus to command him? We've already seen Jesus command the storms before. Up to this point, we've seen him command the waves, command the wind, and they listened. Jesus right now is showing his authority, his power, his dominion over the chaotic seas that can bring death. Right? There's an image within this that we'll unpack in another video. But for now, know this, Jesus walking on water, in a sense, taming the seas by showing that they are beneath him. He is above those waters and that wind and the storm. By doing this, he's showing his authority, his dominion as creator of all things. And Peter is kind of catching that. And he says, you command the waves and the wind. I know that. So command me to come to you on the water. What does Peter conclude here as I fumble my pen? Peter concludes, if you can command the waters and you can walk on the waters because they're at your command, then you can actually command the waters to uphold me by commanding me to come to you. We have Jesus inviting people in Matthew chapter 11, I believe, or 12, to come to him, all who are weary and heavy laden. And he says what? Well, he says, come. He says, come. So Peter got out of the boat, and what does he do? He walks on the water. Now again, what's the environment? We have a bunch of seemingly scared disciples. They still don't seem to be sure that it's Jesus. Maybe they are sure, but Peter at least is catching wind, pun intended, of what's happening, right? And he senses that this possibly could be Jesus. And if it is, he'll command me to come on the water. I always wondered why that was the conclusion Peter comes to. Why does Peter go, I need to verify this is Jesus? Hey, if it's really him, he'll command me to come to him on the water. Well, Jesus says, come. Peter gets out, and you know what Peter starts doing? He starts walking on the water. Now, up to this point, we can say that based on the story of Jesus calming the storm, they were afraid in the middle of the storm of dying from the water and the wind and drowning, right? So in this sense, we can probably say the disciples, though a lot of them are expert fishermen, these storms can often cause a lot of fear within people. And the disciples are no different. The waters around them, the chaotic waters of death that can drown them and take their life, are something that the disciples are afraid of. Now we have Peter walking on those waters that people are afraid to drown in and be overcome by, right? And conquered by. Those waters, Peter's actually walking on, because Jesus, the one who has ultimate authority over the sea, has invited and commanded, not just invited, he commands Peter to come. So now Peter has to obey, which means that the waters will sustain him in order to effectively obey who? Jesus. And the context again is fear. What is Jesus addressing? The fear of his disciples. They still don't see him for who he is. And Peter is one of those. But Peter's at least a little farther along in terms of making these crazy scenarios up in his mind where Jesus can command me to walk on waters. And he does. He walks on it. Jesus answers his faith. So does Peter have faith to walk on water? Or does Peter have faith that Jesus will sustain him on the water? I think it's more that his faith is in Jesus. That's why he says, command me. Because whatever you command, every other surrounding factor has to align with what you say to make me capable of obeying what you said. In other words, Peter goes, Jesus, if you command me to do this, then the waters have to align with your command, and they have to sustain me too. And Peter walks on water. Remember, this is Jesus addressing fear and addressing their really low view of him up to this point. And he came to Jesus. He came to Jesus. Now remember, the command was to come. That's what Jesus said. He said, come. But let's note a shift in the story, a contrast of sorts. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. Notice how often fear and being afraid and being terrified is referenced so far. So far, I at least see 3 references to the concept of fear. And when you see repeating words, I encourage you to just highlight them, take note of them, circle them. Let that give you an indication of what the main point of the passage is. When he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink. Did he fully sink? Did he completely sink? Or did he just start to sink? Well, he started to. Now, who was Peter looking at before? He was looking at Jesus, coming to him, focused on him. Now, what is he looking at and what is he focused on? I'm just going to highlight in yellow the wind to note what Peter is looking at now, which is the reason he starts to sink. And then he's afraid because of what he begins to look at, right? It becomes the focus of Peter's attention and his mind and his thoughts. The wind that's raging around him, which what? Causes fear in him because he takes his eyes off the one who calms the storm and has authority over nature. And he begins to sink. He doesn't actually completely sink. He just starts to. And he cries out, Lord, save me. This is a cry of fear. Just to be very clear, this is a disciple's cry of fear. This is what they say in the middle of the storm earlier in Matthew's gospel. The apostles say, Lord, save us, we are drowning. Well, Peter is actually starting to sink. Jesus immediately reached out his hand. Did Jesus wait? Like he let them fight through the storm? Is he going to let Peter fight a little bit and sink? No, he immediately reaches out his hand, took hold of him, saying to him, oh, you of little faith. So what's the issue here? Little faith and doubt, which is connected to what? Fear. Doubt and little faith connected to what? Being afraid. So the wind caused a kind of fear to creep into Peter that Jesus addresses as having little faith in who? Having little faith in Jesus, because the wind began to become more of a focus to Peter. Almost like in the eyes of Peter, the storm became more important or more powerful than Jesus. Why did you doubt? Doubt what? What exactly did Peter doubt? When they got into the boat, the wind stopped. Why does Matthew make it very clear and chooses to emphasize the fact that the wind stopped. Because what was Peter looking at that caused him to be afraid? The wind. So what does Jesus do to show that Peter has no reason to be afraid? Because Jesus is the one who has authority over everything that might cause fear in us. Well, he calms the wind. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. And there's something about this story, this event, that causes the disciples to even more clearly see Jesus for who he is. And they actually worship him. You don't worship anyone but God, and they know that. So what are they effectively saying by worshiping Jesus? You really are God. How did they come to that conclusion? What gave them that revelation? The fact that Jesus walks on water, sustains Peter, rescues Peter, and then stops the storm once again like he did earlier in Matthew. Truly, you're the Son of God. So what is Jesus doing through this? He's revealing who he is. Why? Because to see Jesus clearly eliminates fear in life. The clearer we see God for who he is, the more capable we see God as being, the more effectively powerful he becomes in our mind, and the greater perspective, clearer perspective we have of God. Fear cannot exist in that environment. In other words, fear diminishes and shrinks when our perspective of God becomes clearer, when we see him for who he is. The disciples worship Jesus. Whereas earlier it seems as though they were afraid of the storm, just like Peter was afraid that he was sinking. He was afraid of the wind. But notice the fear came before the beginning to sink. He wasn't starting to sink and then he became afraid. His focus was off Jesus, and Jesus addresses that by saying, what you are focused on, I have authority and power to stop. And this is what addresses fear and doubt and little faith in our life, is knowing what our God is capable of, seeing him at work in our life, having a growing revelation of who he is, so that instead of focusing on the wind and starting to sink, we worship him for who he is. And there are moments where God will allow us to go through certain things in order to show us who he really is. So we have a clear revelation. We have a greater perspective. We see how effectively powerful and sovereign he really is. And by being in situations where it even looks like I'm going to start to sink, and then he rescues us, just like he did to Peter, we see more of who God actually is. And that leads to worship. Because you can't really worship in the midst of the kind of fear and doubt and little faith that's present. You have to focus on Jesus to have really, to soar above any temptation to fear or doubt, which leads to worship. Now, that doesn't mean you can't worship in the middle of temptation to doubt or fear, but it's really hard to worship when you're choosing to doubt and be afraid instead of focus on Jesus. That's the point of this narrative. This whole event is addressing fear by showing you God is above anything you can possibly imagine to be afraid of. Death itself, he's above it. He can stop it. He can shut anything down he chooses to. And when he calls you to do something and obey, he'll make sure everything aligns with that word to make sure you can effectively do it by his Spirit. I hope this passage, this little study was helpful to you. This really helped me. And if you want to learn how to read the Bible too, maybe you're bored when you read the Bible, frustrated, you don't know where to start, maybe you're overwhelmed, I encourage you to check out our free 40-day Bible study program linked in the description below. Go check it out or visit abovereproachministry.com. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and do that and hit the bell so you can be notified of any future videos that come out. And check out abovereproachministry.com. We have completely free Bible study courses, a 40-day program, a 27-day, and 11-day program, all kinds of free resources. You can get a copy of my book. You can join our online church. You can get some merch. We have a bunch of stuff at abovereproachministry.com. And it's also linked in the description below. Go check that out. And thanks for watching.